The storm raged through the night, rain pouring relentlessly, wind howling like a beast. Lightning lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows over everything it touched. No one could have imagined what would be revealed in the storm's wake. Beneath the floorboards of an old house, workers made a discovery, one that would change everything. A body, wrapped in plastic, was found hidden in the dark. When the police arrived, the shock was undeniable. It was Thomas Hale, the man who had been missing for 2 years. But here's the twist. The person who called the police wasn't a stranger. It was his widow, Evelyn. But didn't she always claim he just left? How could she possibly know his fate? What hidden truths were lurking beneath this tragic reunion? He saved her from drowning when she was 16. She married him at 64, then found his corpse under their home 2 years later. Evelyn Harper often found herself lost in the memories of that summer, 1973, the year her life changed forever. The air was thick with the heat of the day, the sun blazing down on the sparkling water. It was supposed to be a day like any other, a carefree afternoon spent by the lake. But then, everything went wrong. The boat capsized suddenly, throwing Evelyn into the lake. The current was stronger than she had expected. Panic swept through her as she struggled to stay afloat. She wasn't a strong swimmer, and with each stroke, the water seemed to pull her deeper, farther from safety. Fear took over. She knew, deep down, that she was drowning. Just when she thought it was over, a figure appeared out of nowhere. A teenage boy, his name, she wouldn't know yet, appeared through the water like a lifeline. His strong arms reached out, pulling her to safety. He saved her. That boy, Thomas Hale, had become her hero. For Evelyn, that moment was everything. She would never forget the kindness in his eyes, the way he held her and kept her safe. After that day, their paths never crossed again. Time moved on. Evelyn went on to live a full life, marrying, becoming a mother, and eventually becoming a widow. Yet, despite the years that passed, she could never erase the memory of the boy who saved her. Then, 50 years later, something incredible happened. At a high school reunion, of all places, Evelyn found herself face to face with Thomas once again. At first, she didn't recognize him. He was older, of course. His hair had grayed, his face had softened with time, but his eyes were still the same. Warm, familiar, kind. It took a moment before the recognition hit her. "Thomas," Evelyn said, her voice filled with disbelief. He smiled, slow and knowing. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I've been looking for you for so many years." In that moment, Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The years between them faded away. There was something about him, something that made her feel as if they had never been apart, as if time itself had not touched the bond they shared. She had moved on in life, but seeing him again, after all this time, made everything feel like it had come full circle. They spent the evening talking, catching up on everything they had missed over the decades. They shared stories, laughed, and connected in ways they hadn't in years. It was easy, comfortable. It was like picking up right where they left off, as if nothing had changed at all. But there were no words spoken about that day by the lake, no mention of the past. They didn't need to. The chemistry between them was undeniable. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them back together. And within 6 months, Evelyn had married Thomas. It was all so fast, so perfect, and yet, it felt completely right. Their love had been rekindled after all these years, and it felt like fate. For Evelyn, it was the second chance at love she never expected, but one that she had dreamed of for so long. The wedding was simple, quiet, just the two of them, surrounded by close friends. Evelyn had never thought she would marry again, let alone marry someone she had known so long ago. But now, as she stood beside him, the man who had saved her all those years ago, everything felt like it was meant to be. For the first time in decades, Evelyn felt truly happy. She had found the man she had once lost, the man who had been her hero. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything she could point to exactly, but there were moments, little things. The way Thomas avoided certain questions, the way he seemed hesitant when it came to his past. But Evelyn didn't let herself dwell on it. She was in love with him, and that was all that mattered. Or so she thought. What Evelyn didn't know was that the beautiful memories of her youth, the love she had rediscovered, were about to be manipulated in ways she could never have imagined. And the truth of who Thomas really was would soon come crashing down on her. The love story she thought was her happy ending was only just beginning to unravel. And the man she believed was her savior might not have been who he seemed at all. Evelyn's life with Thomas seemed perfect at first. Their home was filled with laughter and love, the kind of life she had dreamed of. But as the days went by, something started to nag at her. It wasn't anything specific at first, just little things. Tiny cracks in the smooth surface of their world. It started with the simplest things, like how Thomas didn't seem to have a social media account. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he wasn't into technology, she reasoned. After all, some people preferred to stay off the grid. But as time went on, the absence of a digital footprint seemed odd, especially in the age they lived in. Everyone had an online presence. Everyone. Then, there were the photos. At family gatherings, at events, Thomas always seemed to avoid being in front of the camera. It wasn't that he wasn't photogenic. He was. But he always found a way to slip away, to hide behind a glass of wine or step out of the frame just as the picture was being taken. He would laugh it off, saying, "I'm not one for the spotlight." But Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. She started to ask him questions, probing gently, trying to piece together the story of his past, but every time she pushed for more details, he would deflect. "Why does it matter?" he'd say with that warm smile that had once made her feel safe. "What's important is right here, right now. We have each other." At first, she believed him. She wanted to. She told herself that the past was behind them, that all that mattered was their future together. But then, one night, Evelyn found something that made her stomach drop. It was a stack of papers, tucked away in the back of a drawer, covered with dust as if they had been hidden for years. It was nothing at first, just some old documents. But then Evelyn's eyes caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. There were names, addresses, and identification numbers, all with a strange sense of urgency about them. And there were dates that didn't match Thomas's story. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the papers. There was a birth certificate, but the name on it wasn't Thomas Hale. It was someone else entirely. Someone she didn't recognize. Her heart raced as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Something wasn't right. She quickly gathered the papers, but just as she turned to leave the room, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn, what's going on?" His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something guarded. She didn't know how to answer. How could she? The evidence was right in front of her, but she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe the man she had married was hiding something so big, so important. "Thomas," she whispered, "who is this?" For the first time, he seemed to hesitate. His usual confidence faltered as he stepped forward and gently took the papers from her hands. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "But I had to protect you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Protect me from what?" He sighed deeply, his eyes looking far away, as though he were seeing something beyond the walls of their home. "I wasn't always Thomas Hale," he confessed. I'm someone else. Someone who had to change everything, start fresh. After the accident, I had to disappear. It was the only way to escape." Her mind spun, trying to process the words. "What accident? What are you talking about?" "The accident that changed my life. I was in a car crash, years ago. I barely survived. When I woke up, everything had changed. I couldn't go back to my old life. I had to take a new name, leave everything behind." His voice cracked, but he quickly regained his composure. "I thought I could leave it all in the past, but now it's all coming back." Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Her hands trembled, and for the first time in months, the warmth that had once surrounded her seemed to drain away. This wasn't the man she had married. The Thomas she knew, her hero, was slipping through her fingers, leaving only fragments of the man he used to be. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was the same man who had saved her all those years ago. But now, everything was uncertain. Everything was a lie. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why hide it?" Thomas stepped closer, reaching out to her. "Because I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want you to see me as someone else, someone broken. I thought you would love me the way I am now, not the way I was before." But Evelyn wasn't sure anymore. What if the person she thought she knew, the person she loved, was just a lie? What if the man she had married was nothing more than a stranger in disguise? There was no easy answer. No comfort. Just a growing sense of doubt, creeping in like a cold wind. She had seen the signs, but had ignored them, brushed them aside because the truth was too painful to confront. Now, the truth was staring her in the face, and it was worse than she had ever imagined. Thomas wasn't who he said he was, and Evelyn wasn't sure if she could ever trust him again. The past had come back to haunt them both, and now there was no turning back. It started like any other evening. The sky had darkened quickly, as it often does before a storm, but there was nothing in the air to suggest how ferocious it would become. The wind began to pick up, though, and soon the rain started falling in sheets, slapping against the windows with an intensity that made everything seem distant, almost unreal. The storm raged through the night, a swirling mass of chaos, the kind of storm that made you stay indoors and pray it passed quickly. But then, when morning came, something was wrong. The storm had left as quickly as it had arrived, but the damage it had caused lingered. Trees had fallen, branches cluttered the streets, and the sky remained overcast, casting a dull light over everything. But there was something else, something more unsettling than the debris scattered everywhere. Thomas was gone. It wasn't immediately clear what had happened. At first, Evelyn thought he might have gone out to check the damage, to make sure everything was okay. But as time passed, the house remained eerily quiet, and the weight of his absence began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. She called his name, walking through the rooms, looking out the windows, but there was no sign of him. He wasn't in the garden, nor in the garage. The car was still parked outside, untouched. Her heart began to race as a growing sense of dread took hold of her. Finally, she called the police. At first, they were skeptical. Thomas had disappeared during a storm. People often went missing in the chaos, especially when flooding was involved. They reassured her, telling her to wait and see. Sometimes people would return after getting caught in the storm or losing their way. But days passed. No sign of Thomas. No word. Evelyn found herself pacing the house, her mind racing through every possible scenario, trying to make sense of it. She remembered the night clearly, how they had sat together, listening to the rain pound against the roof, how he had talked about going to bed early, saying he had a long day ahead. Had he left? Had something happened to him? Or was there another explanation? The police didn't find anything. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. Nothing. They searched the property and the nearby areas, but it was as if Thomas had vanished into thin air. The floodwaters had receded, leaving only the remnants of what had been a violent storm, but there was no trace of him. The town assumed he had been swept away. It made sense, after all. Flooding was dangerous, unpredictable. The strong currents could easily take someone without a trace. Everyone agreed that it was likely just an unfortunate accident. No one doubted the story, but Evelyn couldn't stop thinking. Something didn't feel right. Her gut twisted as she replayed the events over and over in her mind. The storm itself had been intense, but it hadn't lasted long. The damage, while serious, wasn't catastrophic. And yet Thomas, her husband, had simply disappeared. Was it really just a tragic accident? Or was there something more to it? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way he had been acting in the weeks leading up to the storm, distant, distracted, had started to make sense in a way she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. Could it be that he was preparing to leave? Or worse, could he have known something was coming? As the days turned into weeks, the police stopped looking as hard. They had a case to close, a storm to blame, and a missing person to chalk up to the unpredictable force of nature. No one asked any further questions. It was an easy conclusion to accept. Thomas was gone, and no one could say why. But Evelyn wasn't satisfied with the answer. She felt trapped in a fog, unsure of what had happened, unable to fully grasp the truth. She had heard no sounds during the night, no shouting, no signs of struggle, no indication that something violent had occurred. It was as if he had simply vanished, quietly, without a trace. The house felt emptier with each passing day. Her mind kept circling back to the same question: where had he gone? And why had he left her with nothing but silence? It didn't take long before Evelyn began to wonder if the storm itself had been the perfect cover. If the confusion and chaos that it had caused had masked a much darker truth, one she wasn't yet ready to face. Was it possible that Thomas's disappearance had been orchestrated, planned? That the storm had been used as a backdrop to a carefully constructed lie? But Evelyn didn't have the answers yet. All she had was a house full of unanswered questions, and a life that felt like it was slowly unraveling around her. As she sat by the window, staring out at the rain that continued to fall in steady, relentless drops, she couldn't help but wonder, was Thomas gone because of the storm, Or had he vanished for a different reason altogether? Was he truly the man she had married? Or had she been living with a stranger the whole time? The mystery of his disappearance loomed larger with each passing day, and Evelyn's doubts grew, feeding the unease that gnawed at her every moment. What if the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine? It had been 2 years since the storm. 2 years since Evelyn last saw Thomas, heard his voice, or felt the touch of his hand. Life had slowly moved forward, but there was always that lingering emptiness, that whisper of doubt that never quite left. The house felt cold, not just from the absence of him, but from the shadows of unanswered questions that clung to every corner. Then, on a rainy afternoon, everything changed. The rain had come down hard for days, soaking the ground and softening the earth. The streets were flooded, and the air was thick with the smell of wet soil. It was a storm similar to the one that had swept Thomas away 2 years ago. Only this time, it wasn't a matter of losing someone. This time, something was being found. Workers had been called in to repair the foundation of Evelyn's house. The ground beneath the floorboards had started to weaken, the house shifting slightly with each passing day. As they worked in the basement, one of the workers noticed that the old floorboards had started to cave in under the weight of the rain. It wasn't long before he heard something, a strange, hollow sound beneath the floor. Curious, he began to remove the loose boards, and that's when he saw it. At first, it was hard to make out, the shadows in the basement playing tricks on his eyes. But as the boards were lifted, the shape became clearer, a large metal box, buried deep in the dirt beneath the floor. It was old, rusted, and covered in thick plastic. The worker hesitated, his heart racing. It was far too heavy to be just debris. He called his colleagues over, and together, they dragged the box out into the open. The air in the basement felt thicker now, suffocating in a way that made everyone uneasy. The workers gathered around, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly, they pried open the box. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a body. The police were called immediately. Evelyn, still unsure of what was happening, had been summoned to the house. She stood there in the doorway, her hands trembling, as the officers began their work. It felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. It wasn't until the body was examined, the medical examiner's findings released, that the true horror of what had been uncovered began to sink in. The body had been buried for at least 2 years, likely around the time Thomas had disappeared. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, severe enough to cause death almost immediately. The medical examiner's report sent a chill down Evelyn's spine as it became clear the body had been dead before the storm. But it wasn't the cause of death that left Evelyn speechless. It was the identity. The man in the box wasn't Thomas Hale. It wasn't the man she had married, the man she had believed to be her savior. No, the man in the box was someone else entirely. The police ran fingerprints, and the results were chilling. The prints matched those of Thomas Hale, the name Evelyn had come to trust, the man she thought had been lost to the storm. But the truth was far darker than that. Thomas Hale, the real Thomas Hale, had died years earlier, in 1991. He had been in a tragic accident, a car crash that took his life long before Evelyn ever knew him. The man who had saved her life, who had married her, wasn't Thomas Hale at all. The body in the basement wasn't a missing person. It was someone who had been living a lie for decades. It wasn't just an accident or an unfortunate mistake. It was an elaborate deception, a false identity built on a foundation of secrets and lies. The question Evelyn couldn't stop asking herself, the question that echoed in her mind every time she closed her eyes, was this: who had she really been living with? Who had been the man who had promised her love, who had made her feel safe, who had stood by her side for all those years? And why had he done it? Why had he chosen to take on the identity of a man who had died so long ago? The twist of fate, the shocking revelation that the man she had married was an imposter, left Evelyn reeling. Her mind struggled to piece together the puzzle that had been her life for the past few years. The man she had shared everything with, the man who had seemed so perfect, was a stranger. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved, wasn't even real. He had been living in the shadow of a dead man's name, a ghost that had walked through her life pretending to be someone else. Every memory, every moment she had shared with him, now felt like a lie. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the basement, staring at the officers who were working quickly, taking photographs, gathering evidence. She felt as if the ground beneath her feet had given way. She wanted to scream, to ask them what was happening, to tell them how wrong all of this felt. But the words wouldn't come. The truth was too much to bear. The man who had saved her, the man who had promised her forever, was gone. But who had been standing in front of her all this time? Evelyn couldn't stop herself from thinking of the storm. The way it had all started. The way he had disappeared, leaving nothing but confusion behind. Had it been planned? Was the storm just a cover, a way to make it all disappear without question? She didn't know. All she knew now was that the man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, had never existed at all. The body in the basement had opened a door to a truth that Evelyn wasn't prepared to face. And as the pieces of her life began to crumble around her, she couldn't help but wonder, who else had been deceived by this man? And what was the real reason behind his twisted impersonation? The discovery of the body had been just the beginning. As the shock wore off, the process of unraveling the truth began. The mystery of Thomas Hale, the man who had never been Thomas Hale, had taken on the shape of a true crime investigation. And now, the search for answers was about to get real. The police had started with the basics: fingerprints, dental records, and DNA. But it wasn't until they compared the DNA that they found a definitive match. The body, the one that had been lying in that box for 2 years, wasn't Thomas Hale at all. The tests revealed the true identity of the deceased, Richard Klein. Richard Klein wasn't a name that Evelyn had ever heard before, but it was a name that the police recognized all too well. Klein had a criminal record, a long one. The man who had been living with Evelyn wasn't a hero, a savior, or even a man of any real integrity. He was a con artist, a master of deception. His past was riddled with lies, fraud, and a history of tricking people into believing he was someone he wasn't. He had posed as doctors, firefighters, and even a preacher. All of his personas had one thing in common. He preyed on older women. Women who were vulnerable. Women who were looking for someone to believe in, someone to trust. And Richard Klein had used that trust as his weapon. He knew how to manipulate. He knew how to make them fall in love with him. Make them believe that he was everything they ever wanted, everything they ever needed. Evelyn, like the others before her, had been swept off her feet. He had played the role of the charming, devoted man, the one who had rescued her from drowning all those years ago. He had convinced her that they were soulmates, that they were meant to be together, and she had believed him. She hadn't seen the cracks in his story, the lies woven into the fabric of his personality. But now, as the pieces of his past began to fall into place, Evelyn saw the truth with painful clarity. The man she had married, this stranger, this imposter, was a skilled manipulator. His whole life had been one big act, carefully crafted to deceive the people he encountered, to use them, and then to discard them once he'd gotten what he wanted. Richard Klein had been a master at assuming new identities. He had been a doctor at one point, using his fake credentials to gain access to vulnerable women who trusted him with their health and lives. He had pretended to be a firefighter, stepping into the role of a hero, saving women from burning buildings or accidents, earning their admiration and affection. But it wasn't just about playing a part. It was about gaining control, about knowing exactly how to make someone believe in him, to make them depend on him. And that's exactly what he had done with Evelyn. When the investigators dug deeper into his past, they found a trail of victims, all of whom had fallen prey to his charms. Older women, women who had lost their spouses, women who were lonely, women who were looking for someone to take care of them. Each one had been swindled by the same man, in the same way. The pattern was chillingly clear. He didn't just steal money or possessions. He stole trust, he stole love, and he manipulated emotions in ways that were far more destructive than any financial scam. Evelyn had been no different. She had believed in him. She had trusted him completely. When he had proposed to her, she had seen it as the culmination of a beautiful, unexpected love story. She thought they had built something real, something unbreakable. But now, as the truth about Richard Klein's past came to light, she realized how much of her life had been nothing more than a lie. It was a brutal realization. The man she had spent years with, the man she had loved, the man she had married, he had never been real. Everything she thought she knew about him, about their relationship, was shattered. The wedding vows, the shared memories, the promises, none of it had been sincere. She had been nothing more than another mark on his long list of victims. The investigators had no shortage of evidence to support their case. His fingerprints were found on documents that linked him to previous identities. His DNA matched those found at various crime scenes where women had reported their encounters with a man who fit his description. The pattern was unmistakable. Richard Klein had been on a mission, a lifelong pursuit of conning women into believing he was their savior. And Evelyn, in the depths of her heartbreak, now understood how he had been able to deceive her so completely. He had known exactly how to play her emotions, how to use her vulnerabilities against her. He had learned how to be everything she needed him to be, only to tear her life apart once he had secured his place in it. The question that haunted her now wasn't just about who Richard Klein was. It was about who she had been. How could she have been so blind? How could she have fallen for a man who had so carefully constructed a web of lies around her? It wasn't just the love she had given him that hurt. It was the time she had wasted, the life she had built around someone who never existed. As the investigation continued, the police closed in on Richard Klein's past, tracking his movements, linking him to more of his false identities. They found records of his previous scams, some dating back decades. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. He had lived his entire life as a parasite, feeding off the emotions of others, using love as a tool for manipulation. For Evelyn, the truth was a heavy burden, but it was also a revelation, one that gave her a sense of closure, a bitter sort of peace. She had been deceived, but now she knew who the man really was. She knew the depth of his lies, and she knew that she could never let his twisted version of love define her life again. Richard Klein may have stolen her trust, but he couldn't take away her strength. And as the investigation continued to uncover the layers of his deception, Evelyn realized that the hardest part wasn't learning who he truly was. It was reclaiming her own story, her own identity, and learning to trust again. She had been deceived, yes, but now she was determined to rebuild, this time on her own terms. As the investigation into Richard Klein's true identity continued, the police began to piece together the disturbing details of his past. But just as they thought they were closing in on the final truths, something unexpected happened. The focus of the investigation shifted. Suddenly, the spotlight turned to Evelyn. It began with small, unsettling contradictions. At first, they were easy to dismiss. The missing persons case had seemed so cut and dry. Thomas Hale had disappeared, likely drowned in the storm. But now, with the discovery of Richard Klein's body and the mounting evidence of his deception, questions that once seemed irrelevant began to take on a new weight. As the details of the case unfolded, the police began to look at Evelyn more closely. The first thing that raised suspicion was the key to the basement. The police had discovered that the basement where Richard's body had been hidden only had one key. That key was in Evelyn's possession. The workers who had uncovered the body had noted that there were no signs of a break-in, no forced entry into the house. Richard hadn't been dragged into the basement. He hadn't stumbled there in the chaos of the storm. No, someone had put him there. And that someone, it seemed, was Evelyn. Then there was the matter of Richard's assets. It made sense at first that he had been killed for money. Con men like him often leave behind financial traces. But as investigators delved deeper into his records, they realized something strange. Nothing had been taken from Richard. His assets, his savings, even the valuables in his home were untouched. Evelyn hadn't taken anything from him, which raised a glaring question. If she hadn't killed him for money, then what was the real motive? The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but they weren't making a complete picture. There was still something off, something that didn't quite add up. The police continued to dig through the financial records, and that's when they found a key piece of evidence that couldn't be ignored, a credit card transaction. 3 days after Thomas had disappeared, Evelyn had made a large purchase, cement, large containers, and other supplies, at a local hardware store. She had paid for it with her credit card. It wasn't unusual to buy supplies, of course, but the timing was what caught the police's attention. Why would Evelyn need cement? Why would she need such a large quantity just days after Thomas had gone missing? It was a strange detail, and the investigators knew that it couldn't be coincidence. With growing suspicion, they continued to question Evelyn, trying to make sense of the timeline and the events leading up to Richard's death. The more they dug, the more contradictions began to surface. Evelyn had claimed that Thomas had simply disappeared during the storm, that he had been swept away by the floodwaters. But how could she explain the cement, the large containers, the fact that she had purchased the supplies shortly after his disappearance? The pieces weren't just adding up, they were leading to a darker conclusion. The police began to put more pressure on Evelyn, and with each passing question, a sense of guilt seemed to hang in the air. There was no evidence that Evelyn had directly harmed Richard. There were no signs of struggle, no blood in the house, no obvious marks on his body that would indicate violence. But the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and the strange purchases she had made were beginning to look more and more suspicious. Evelyn's responses became more defensive. She tried to explain the purchases, saying that she had planned to do some home repairs after the storm, but the officers weren't buying it. The more they asked, the more her story seemed to crumble. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was being concealed, something much darker than they had originally suspected. What if Richard hadn't been the only one with a motive? What if Evelyn had known more than she had let on? Had she been involved in his death? And if so, why? What could drive a woman to kill the man she had loved, the man she had trusted, the man she had married? As the investigation continued, the tension in the air grew. Evelyn was no longer just a grieving widow. She had become the primary suspect. The police had already uncovered Richard's fraudulent past, his history of deceiving women, but Evelyn's role in the aftermath was still unclear. It didn't make sense. She hadn't taken money from him. There was no obvious reason why she would want him dead. But then the investigators uncovered something that shook them to their core. The more they learned about Richard's past, the more they realized that he hadn't just been deceiving Evelyn. He had been manipulating her, using her for something far more insidious. Evelyn had been a victim, yes, but she had also been complicit. The relationship between them had been one of mutual manipulation, both of them playing parts in a twisted game that neither fully understood until it was too late. As they dug deeper into Richard's relationship with Evelyn, they uncovered evidence of coercion, psychological manipulation, and a twisted form of control. Richard had used Evelyn's vulnerabilities against her, playing on her emotions and her loneliness. But Evelyn, in turn, had used Richard, keeping him close as a way to fill the void left by years of loss. In the end, the story wasn't just about murder. It was about love turned toxic, about the ways in which people can manipulate and control one another without even realizing it. Evelyn's involvement in Richard's death wasn't about money or revenge. It was about the breakdown of a relationship built on lies and deceit. Evelyn had been a victim, yes, but in her actions, in the decisions she had made, she had crossed a line. She had allowed herself to become part of a darker, more dangerous game. And now, she was facing the consequences of that. The question wasn't just whether Evelyn had killed Richard. It was whether she had ever truly been the person she thought she was, or if she had been another victim of Richard Klein's twisted manipulation all along. The moment the confession left Evelyn's lips, it felt as though everything had shifted. The weight of the truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For so long, she had kept the secret buried deep inside her, hidden beneath layers of fear and guilt. But now, as she spoke, it all came pouring out slowly, like a dam finally breaking. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice shaking, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry. "I never meant to kill him." Evelyn had never been someone who was quick to act on impulse. She had always prided herself on being careful, thoughtful. But that night, everything had changed. That night, something inside her snapped. She had come home early, not expecting to find him there. But there he was, sitting in their living room, papers spread out in front of him. Evelyn had known something was wrong. The house had been quiet, but it hadn't felt right. And then she saw it. The papers, the plans, the bank statements, the lists. Richard was planning to leave her. He was planning to sell their home, drain their accounts, and disappear. Everything they had built, everything they had shared, was a lie. It was all part of the game he had been playing with her all along. When Evelyn confronted him, the arguments that had been simmering for months finally erupted. Words were exchanged, heated, cruel. Richard was calm, too calm, in the face of her fury. He had always been calm, always so collected. And in that moment, Evelyn's anger surged, a blind, overwhelming tide that she couldn't control. "I saw what you were doing," she said, the memory flashing before her eyes. "I saw the papers, the plans. You were going to leave me, take everything, and just vanish. You weren't going to let me know. You were going to leave me with nothing." His response was cold. "You've always been too emotional, Evelyn. You never understood. It's just business. And that was when it happened. The argument turned physical, but not in the way she had ever expected. In a moment of blind rage, Evelyn pushed him. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't premeditated, but the force of it was enough. He stumbled backward, crashing into the coffee table, and hit his head hard on the corner. For a moment, everything froze. The air was still. Richard didn't move. His eyes were open, but there was no life behind them. Evelyn stood there, staring, her heart racing. A cold dread washed over her as she knelt beside him, trembling. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It was just a push, a way to stop him, to make him listen, to make him feel the same fear she felt in that moment. She hadn't meant for this to happen. She hadn't meant for him to fall, to hit his head the way he did. But the reality was undeniable. He was gone. Evelyn didn't know what to do. Her mind raced, her heart pounded in her chest. Panic set in. The thought of calling the police, of explaining how it had happened, made her feel sick. She couldn't. She couldn't let the truth come out. She couldn't bear the thought of being labeled a murderer, a woman who killed her own husband. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She hid the body. She wrapped Richard's body in plastic, placed it in the basement, and locked it away. For days, she acted as if everything was normal. She went on with her routine, pretending that her world hadn't just crumbled beneath her feet. She kept up the lie, telling anyone who asked that Richard, had just disappeared. She made excuses when people inquired, when his absence began to raise questions. But the guilt never left. It gnawed at her every moment of the day. It haunted her at night, in her dreams, in the silence of the house. I didn't mean to, she repeated, over and over, as she sat alone in the interrogation room. I didn't mean for him to die. I just wanted him to stop. I just wanted him to listen, to understand how much he had hurt me. But it got out of control. Evelyn's voice trembled, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. She had tried to justify it to herself, tried to convince herself that what she had done wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the truth was inescapable. She had killed him. She had taken the life of the man she had trusted, the man who had betrayed her, but who she had still loved. Her actions, the way she had tried to cover up the crime, had only made everything worse. The lie she had told, the length she had gone to in order to conceal the truth, it was all part of the darkness she had been hiding from. She had been running from the consequences of her own actions, afraid to face what she had done. And now, with the confession hanging in the air between her and the investigators, she could no longer deny it. I thought I was protecting myself, she whispered, the tears beginning to fall. But I was just protecting my own shame, my own fear. I didn't want to admit that I was wrong. I didn't want to admit that I was capable of this. The confession had come too late. Evelyn knew that now. She had tried to make sense of the impossible situation, to justify the lie, to make peace with the part of her that had snapped in the heat of the moment. But now, all that was left was regret, deep, crushing regret. There was no undoing what she had done. There was no way to take back the pain she had caused. She had been consumed by anger and fear, and in that moment, she had lost herself. Evelyn stood in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she listened to the charges being read aloud. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. Second-degree murder, concealment of a body, filing a false missing persons report. The legal jargon rolled off the prosecutor's tongue like an unyielding tide, each phrase crashing over her, pulling her further into a reality she couldn't escape. Her trial had been long, the evidence mounting against her with every passing day. There was no doubt about her actions. Evelyn had confessed, had admitted to pushing Richard in the heat of the moment. She had told the world that she never intended for him to die, that the death was an accident. But that didn't change the fact that Richard was dead, that she had hidden his body, and that she had lived a lie for 2 long years. The courtroom was filled with tension. The prosecution had presented their case with cold precision, citing the evidence, the cement purchase, the hidden body, Evelyn's conflicting statements. There was no way to argue her actions weren't deliberate, no way to deny that she had covered up Richard's death for the sake of her own protection. On the other side, the defense tried to paint a different picture, one of a woman driven to despair by the betrayal of the man she loved. Evelyn's lawyer argued that her crime was born of emotional duress, that she had snapped in a moment of rage when confronted with the shocking truth about Richard's deception. He argued that Evelyn hadn't set out to kill him. She had only wanted to stop him, to prevent him from leaving her with nothing. But the reality was harsh. The facts were clear. Evelyn had concealed the body for 2 years, gone to great lengths to maintain the lie, and in doing so, had obstructed justice. Her crime, though fueled by betrayal, was still a crime. The court couldn't ignore that. The final verdict came down with chilling finality. Evelyn was sentenced to 18 years in prison for second-degree murder and for concealing the body. The judge had shown some leniency, given her age and the emotional strain she had been under, but the sentence was still harsh. Evelyn's hands shook as the gavel came down, a reminder that no matter how much she had suffered, the law could not ignore the consequences of her actions. But as the verdict was read, the reaction from the public was divided. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered, their opinions loud and clear. Some saw Evelyn as a victim, a woman betrayed by the man she loved, pushed to the edge by his lies. They believed she had acted out of a desperate need to protect herself, that her crime was the result of a broken heart, a mind overwhelmed by betrayal. They saw her as a woman who had snapped under the weight of too many secrets and too many lies. Others, however, saw her as a murderer, a woman who had taken a life and then covered it up for years. To them, it didn't matter what Richard had done. The fact was, Evelyn had made a choice. She had chosen to hide the truth, to live in the lie, and in doing so, she had denied Richard his justice, denied the truth that had been so desperately needed. In the eyes of the public, Evelyn had become a symbol of a broken system, of a world where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by emotion, by betrayal. Some argued that she had been justified, that her actions were the result of love twisted into something dark and dangerous. Others believed that she had taken the easy way out, choosing to cover up the truth rather than face the consequences of her actions. The debate raged on long after the trial ended. In the quiet of her cell, Evelyn was left to reflect on the life she had lost, on the choices that had brought her here. She had spent so long convincing herself that she had done the right thing, that she had acted in self-defense. But now, in the silence of her own mind, she knew the truth. She had made a choice. She had chosen to hide, to lie, to protect herself rather than face the consequences of her anger and fear. And in doing so, she had lost everything. Evelyn wasn't just facing the legal consequences of her actions. She was facing the moral consequences, the emotional toll of a decision that had shattered her life. The law had spoken, but in the court of public opinion, the jury was still out. Some would forever see her as a victim, a woman wronged by the man she loved. Others would always see her as a murderer, a woman who took a life in the name of self-preservation. But the truth was more complicated than any courtroom could handle. It wasn't just about right or wrong. It was about the fragile line between love and betrayal, between rage and reason. And Evelyn, now alone in the cold confines of prison, would have to live with that truth for the rest of her life. In the stillness of her prison cell, Evelyn wrote. The words flowed from her, a mixture of regret, confusion, and a haunting sense of loss. It had been months since the trial, since the gavel had fallen, and yet her mind remained in turmoil. She penned a letter, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. As she wrote, she found herself questioning everything she had believed about love, about herself, and about the man she had once trusted with her heart. I loved him, she wrote, but he never really existed. The love I thought I had was real, but was it just a dream I created? Was it all a lie I wanted to believe, a fantasy that I allowed to consume me? Evelyn's words were raw, a confession that no courtroom could ever fully understand. The man she had loved, the one who had made her feel safe, had been a stranger in disguise. He had never been who he said he was. But the love she felt for him, the connection they shared, had been real to her. She had given herself to him, heart and soul. She had trusted him with everything she had, only to discover it was all built on a lie. Now, in the silence of her cell, she grappled with a question that had no easy answer. If you kill the person who destroyed your life, the one who lied and manipulated you, do you deserve to be treated like any other criminal? Evelyn's actions were driven by an overwhelming need to protect herself, to stop the man who had torn her world apart. But the law was clear, taking a life, no matter the reason, was still murder. Now, as she reflected on everything, the line between victim and perpetrator had blurred. She was both the victim of a ruthless con man and the one who ended a life in a moment of rage. What do you think? Evelyn asked, her voice silent in the room but echoing in the thoughts of anyone who might listen. Is Evelyn a victim or a murderer? Does killing a liar who destroyed your life make you any less guilty? Is it different from killing anyone else? If this story makes you think about love, about the memories we choose to hold on to, and about the things we sometimes refuse to see, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you want to hear more stories like this, sad but hauntingly beautiful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because these real stories, they stay with us long after the last page is turned.